Yo, the enemy's public, I gotta keep my eyes open. Pay attention, stop walking around like you blindfolded. This not the World Cup, but Nasir be kicking knowledge. This the type of information you can never learn in college. It's time to fight back, it's no more trying to play it cool. We got interviews, podcasts, and got the latest news. So sit back and relax, we about to get it started. Earth is a canvas, and guess who's the con artist? They brainwashing us, the system corrupted. You are now rocking with the enemy's public. You are now rocking with the enemy's public. I said you are now rocking with the enemy's public. Hey.
Peace. This is the enemy's public. I am Bro.Nasir. Have you ever heard the term and phrase, get out of town before sundown? That phrase and term was used frequently on a Western, but the origin of that term pertained to our people. There are certain towns in the United States that are considered sundown towns. Salute, peace to Doe Eyes TV. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate that. But there's certain towns in the United States that are called sundown times, meaning that Black people who are in those towns are told that they shouldn't be in those towns when the sun goes down, or they are subjected to be beaten, harm done to them, or even lynched or shot to death. And most of the time, it was law enforcement that were participating in this type of behavior. Peace to my brother, Big Dog Philly OG. Thanks for coming through, good brother. Oftentimes, it was law enforcement participating in this behavior, along with the Ku Klux Klan, who also were and are police officers. Now, sundown towns still exist to this very day. Now, young brothers and sisters were found hanged in 2021, 22, and 23 because they were found in a town after the sun went down. Now, I'm going to go over a few towns that are considered sundown towns before I don't know why I keep saying times, because this is times we're in. The sundown towns, I'm going to go over a few before I do a video presentation. Some are lengthy, but I'm not going to play them all. But I'm going to go over a few sundown towns. Now, all the way up in the north is Darien, Connecticut. That is considered a sundown town. Adena, Minnesota, Fuchsia, Colorado, Groton, Massachusetts, Kennewick, Washington, Lemon, South Dakota, Levittown, Pennsylvania. I'm sure the good brother, Big Dog Philly OG, is familiar with that. Now, let me see. It's quite a few sundown towns in Florida. They should make Sanford, Florida, a sundown town because a young 17-year-old was walking from a 7-Eleven going to get some Skittles and some Arizona iced tea. And he was found in Sanford, Florida after the sun went down. And exactly, Doe Eyes, Hagerstown, Maryland also was a sundown town. But a young brother by the name of Trayvon Martin was going back home, and a racist caught up with him after the sun went down, and he murdered the young brother and got away with it. So Sanford, Florida should be considered a sundown town. Like Gulfport, Florida, Jay, Florida, Ocoee, we know that the Ocoee massacre, that's a sundown town. And Zephyllus, Florida, that's a sundown town. There's a few in Georgia also. Cumming, Georgia, Fitzgerald, Georgia, Forsyth County, Georgia, the entire county, and Emmons Park, Georgia, is a sundown town, meaning get out of town before the sun go down. Now, I'm going to go to my state, which is New Jersey. We have two. Hoboken, New Jersey. That's up north near New York. And I don't know how this town made the get out of town before sundown list. Willingboro. I know a lot of people in Willingboro. I don't know how it is. I have family in Willingboro Township, New Jersey, down by Mount Laurel, where it had to be a pull-up summer last year when a racist harassed a brother, and the whole entire town forced the police to arrest him for what he did to the brother in Mount Laurel down there by Willingboro. I mean, it's so many sundown towns in the United States. Illinois has 19. Indiana has 44 sundown towns. Adams County, Aurora, Benton, Blackford, Bluffton, Brown, Crawford, Decatur, Indiana, DeKalb County, Elwood, Enterprise, Franklin, Gas City, Goshen, Grandview, Greensburg, Greenwood, Hobart, Howell, Huntington County, entire counties, Jasper County, LaGrange County, Lake County, Indiana, Leavenworth, Linton, Marshall, Martin. It's just so many sundown towns in Indiana. That's a lot of town. That means they don't want us nowhere in Indiana. 44. Illinois has 19. They have 19 towns in the state of Illinois. Anna, Benton, Calhoun, Cicero, DeLand, Deerfield, Effingham, El Dorado, Granite, Kenilworth, Oak Park, Oblong, Panna, Pekin, Salem, Sandoval, Cesar, Vienna, Ziegler. All these towns in Illinois are sundown towns. They don't want us in these towns. And I want to do a video presentation of the history of sundown towns. I'm not going to play them in its entirety because one of them is kind of lengthy. But just to get an idea what I'm talking about concerning these sundown towns. This information we have to have because it was a brother in Jasper, Texas, who was stranded. He was offered a ride. This was in 1998. His name was James Bird in Jasper, Texas. He was offered a ride in the back of a pickup truck by some white guys. They said he'll take them into town. They're going that way. And they stopped to have beer. When they got drunk, they tied this brother to the back of that pickup truck by chains, and they dragged him for over 3 miles. And by the time they found him, they found pieces of his body part within a 3 to 4 mile radius. So we have to be mindful about these sundown towns and what happened and what could happen if we're caught in them. The same state where Ron DeSantis is trying to change history and rewrite history right in our face, not caring that we see him doing this. They have plenty of sundown towns in the state of Florida. Some of those towns never changed.
Some would rather pretend that they don't exist, burning and destroying evidence that these places thrived to begin with, while others can never forget the atrocities committed after dark. So, hello and welcome to Prism of the Past, a semi-weekly series about historical events, people, and situations, from the fascinating to the forgotten. I'm the Illuminati, and today we're going to be talking about sundown towns with a slight focus on Cullman, Alabama. We'll also mention quite a few other sundown towns along the way, and you'll see why I wanted to talk about Cullman in particular in just a bit. Before we get into it, this episode is going to feature a lot of racism, violence, and other things of that nature, so if it upsets you, I recommend skipping today's episode. Let's begin by discussing what a sundown town is, where they come from, and before we talk about how sundown towns exist in the modern day. Let's get into it. After slavery and the Civil War ended, Black people began to move across the United States. Many remained in the South, and once Reconstruction ended, Southern states set up a system that looked a lot like slavery: the Jim Crow laws. Under these laws, that were named after a Black minstrel show character, Black people couldn't vote and wouldn't be accommodated at restaurants, parks, hotels, schools, or just about anywhere really that was used by white people. Black codes were, simply put, a legal way to put Black citizens into indentured servitude and control them. And since former Confederate soldiers could work as police officers and judges, it made it incredibly difficult for any Black citizens to fight against the system or win any kind of court case. The ABHM, America's Black Holocaust Museum, writes how this mindset spread across the entire U.S. Most Americans have no idea how much race relations worsened between 1890 and the 1930s, and not just in the South. In fact, Black Americans were the targets of racial violence and discrimination in the North, East, and West as well. Still, there was a greater opportunity for family-supporting jobs and a better life outside the South, so millions of Blacks left in one of the largest immigrations in history. This is known as the Great Migration, and it transformed America. For example, African Americans reached every county of Montana. More than 400 lived in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. City neighborhoods across the country were fairly integrated too, even if the Black inhabitants were often servants or gardeners for white neighbors. Between 1890 and the 1930s, however, all of this changed. By 1930, although its white population had increased by 75%, Michigan's Upper Peninsula was home to only 331 African Americans, and 180 of them were inmates of the Marquette State Prison. 11 Montana counties had no Blacks at all. Across the country, city neighborhoods grew more and more segregated. Predominantly white communities between 1890 and 1960 actively discouraged Blacks from settling there. In its most blatant form, signs would be posted at the city limits. In Alex, Arkansas in the 1930s, their sign read, "N-word, don't let the sun go down on you in Alex," while others read, "Whites only after dark." These towns would also use discriminatory housing covenants to ensure that no non-white people could purchase or rent a home. Legal documents for Chevy Chase, Maryland, read that any person of Negro blood or any person of the Semitic race was forbidden to buy or lease property. I'm not at all surprised that these communities were sometimes anti-Semitic as well. Small towns would keep out Black people, Jews, Catholics, Greeks, Italians, Indians, and even trade unionists and gays. Businesses that served Black customers or hired Black employees would be boycotted, and postcards from these towns would say things like, "A good place to live, no Negroes," proud of their racial exclusion. Violence, too, was used to keep Black people out of these sundown towns. African Americans that lingered in these towns even in the day would experience harassment, threats, arrest, and beatings. According to blackpast.org, an online encyclopedia about African American and global African history, it was not uncommon for Black motorists
Peace to Riza Lopez and my brother Bronx Flat Power God. Thanks for coming through.
passing through these communities to be followed by police or local residents to the city limits. In extreme cases, hostility towards African Americans resulted in extrajudicial killing. The lynching of 2 Black teenagers in Marion, Indiana in 1930, for instance, resulted in the town's 200 Black residents moving away, never to return. The rise of sundown towns made it difficult and dangerous for Blacks to travel long distances by car. In 1930, for instance, 44 of the 89 counties along the famed Route 66 from Chicago to Los Angeles featured no motels or restaurants and prohibited Blacks from entering after dark. In response, Victor H. Green, a postal worker from Harlem, compiled the Negro Motorist Green Book, a guide to recommendations that served Black travelers. The guide was published from 1936 to 1966, and at its height of popularity was used by 2 million people. An Atlantic article that discusses the routes of Route 66 also addresses this. While for many, Route 66 is seen as the road of dreams or the mother road and the essence of the American dream itself, for others, it's a nightmare. After all, Route 66 started out in Illinois, a state that had 150 sundown towns alone. Before Route 66 was
On 150 sundown towns. That means that there's 150 places where they don't want us to be caught there when the sun go down, or they're going to do harm to us or worse.
was even connected and enshrined, the roads that formed it linked one atrocity to the next. Their article reads, take example, one violent night in 1906 in Springfield, Missouri, which would soon become the birthplace of Route 66. Though the road starts out in Chicago, the route was officially designated as 66 in Springfield. During a grisly lynching on Easter weekend, a vigilante white mob dragged Horace Duncan and Fred Coker to the town square, hanged them, burned their bodies while thousands watched, and then distributed their body parts among the crowd as keepsakes.
This is the origin of the word picnic. Pick a nigga to hang, tar, feather, and lynch, and burn at the stake. So those of us who indulge and go to picnics, just know the origin of the word.
In 1921, the Tulsa race riot erupted in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was one of the nation's most devastating acts of terrorism against African Americans. Greenwood was an unusually vibrant community of successful.
Now, this is what Ron DeSantis want our children to think and know. They want our children to think that we had it coming and we caused the violence that was committed on us. He wants to change the whole narrative of what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Greenwood, Peoria, Illinois, all these other places that are sundown towns or towns that we built that were successful and thriving. They got jealous and wanted, and they use any and every excuse to attack us. But the main thing they used to use when it came to attacking us was that one of us probably reckless eyeballed one of their women or spoke to one of their women or sexually aggressed one of their women. And they, bombed all of our cities and committed acts of terrorism on our people.
Black entrepreneurs, doctors, and lawyers. Booker T. Washington called it Black Wall Street, and it was arguably the wealthiest Black neighborhood in the South. But after a young Black man was wrongfully accused of assaulting a white woman, an angry lynch mob broke out. Long-held
I'm glad she said wrongfully accused of assaulting a white woman.
Jealousies over black prosperity and Greenwood's wealth ignited a riot. The white mob set the neighborhood on fire. After 16 hours, at least 300 people had died, 35 blocks of the Greenwood district had burned to the ground, and more than 10,000 black residents had been left homeless. Many sundown towns seem to have deliberately hid these chapters in their history, and according to Black Past, there are often few archival records in these towns that precisely described how they excluded blacks. Still, the evidence that we do have about these sundown towns and the way they treated people is horrifying. Keep in mind, these sundown towns weren't just all white towns, but towns that were all white on purpose, actively keeping black people out by any means necessary. The definition of a sundown town changes slightly depending on who you're speaking to. Some say it's a place where blacks were actively forced out, and that housing discrimination alone doesn't make a sundown town. Others say there isn't much of a difference, as many places where blacks couldn't buy a house were also places where they wouldn't be safe. Lowen, a sociologist and author of the book Sundown Towns who researched their history extensively, says that, quote, I think suburbs tended to have a little more finesse in their racism, but I'm not going to back off, end quote. And for the record, Lowen is widely considered an expert on this topic about sundown towns, so expect to see his name again quite frequently throughout this episode. And of course, as we've seen more and more in recent years, these sundown towns had pseudoscience on their side. Eugenics proved, in their minds anyway, that black people were brutes in order to justify slavery and their behavior. At times, entire counties went sundown.
It's like calling us racist while you're committing an act of racism, saying that we play the race cards for calling them out on racism. We don't have a deck of cards to play the race cards.
Down. In Mississippi County, Arkansas, for example, a red line that was originally a road surveyor mark defined a deadline beyond which African Americans shouldn't travel to the west. And this was effectively cutting off over 2,000 square miles. Yet, as opposed to the learning about this disturbing chapter in U.S. history, some students are taught a very different version of events. When Lowen began teaching as a university professor of sociology in Mississippi in 1968, his students told him that they thought Reconstruction was the period right after the Civil War when blacks took over the government of the southern states, but since they were newly freed slaves, they just screwed it up and white folks had to take control again. Lowen said that upon hearing this, his heart sank, and that was a glimpse of just how twisted America's history had become. A piece of that history is, of course, the sundown town. Although this is truly only a very, very brief history of what sundown towns are, I want to start to focus on Coleman specifically. It's believed that they are still a sundown town to this day, and so using them as an example, let's take a look at how a sundown town has changed over the years into the modern day. Coleman, Alabama was one of these sundown towns. It displayed a sign that read, N-word, don't let the sun go down on your head in this town. Some version used a different body part such as the back versus the head, but the message is essentially the same. One article written by Ben Winham in Tuscaloosa News says that though he and some former Coleman residents say they never saw such a sign growing up in northern Alabama, the internet is full of stories to the contrary. One person wrote that his wife told him about a sign saying, Welcome to Coleman, with a subhead that read, N-word, don't let the sun set behind your back. Another claimed there was a huge billboard right at the Coleman city limits on Highway 278 saying, N-word, don't let the sun set on your butt in this town. That was on display as late as 1989. A picture of a Klansman and a burning cross accompanied the message, or so the anonymous poster claimed. Charles Tisdale, publisher of the Jackson Miss Advocate, wrote in a 2000 column that Coleman posted a sign for many, many years on its main street that read, N-word, read and run. If you can't read, just run. Another writer claimed the same message was on a series of signs modeled on the old Burma Shave advertisements, posted one after the other on a road leading to Coleman. One of the internet authors even claimed that though Coleman's sundown sign was dismantled years ago, it remains in storage in the basement of a county courthouse. The widely differing accounts led me to lean towards thinking that the sundown sign in Coleman was just an urban or country myth. Even Lowen's book, which identifies Coleman as one of the cities with a national reputation as a sundown town, its percentage of black residents in 2000 was 0.7% according to the U.S. Census, does not mention a sign. And this is what I and Ben Winham find so interesting about Coleman. It feels like no two people can agree on the town. What seems to be generally agreed upon, though, is that while sometimes, like Arab Alabama, wouldn't allow blacks to enter during the day, Coleman needed black day workers. According to Lowen, the author we mentioned earlier,
do your work and get out of town before sundown. That's their sentiment.
That resulted in a community about 20 miles south of Coleman that was virtually all African American. He wrote that it existed to house the black labor pool that was excluded from living in Coleman. Maids, janitors, handymen, and blacks and whites alike called it the colony. The Coleman Tribune wrote an article about the colony in 2015 and seemed to twist the narrative about what this community actually was. In their article, they claim, "It is believed that the colony, Alabama, was originally settled after the Civil War during Reconstruction and following the emancipation or freedom of slaves. The people that came to live in the area now known as Colony had probably been freed slaves from the old settlement of Baltimore, Alabama. It is Coleman County's only African American community, and in its early days, it was considered a safe haven for African Americans in the Deep South." Nowhere in this article does it mention that black people weren't allowed to live in other places of Coleman County. Instead, this article makes the area sound welcoming when it was anything but. In fact, a former hospital administrator from Coleman said that they believe the sign stood until about 1972, as well as a graduate student from Coleman. Some stories about Coleman read as follows. "My mother told us that the drugstore where Greyhound buses used to stop in Coleman had no black facilities at all. Blacks riding on the main bus line from Nashville to Birmingham and Point South would step off in Coleman to look for restrooms only to be turned back. And mothers could be heard explaining to their crying children that they would have to wait until farther down the road." If you want to read the quote in its entirety, of course, my sources will always be available. While I normally try not to include too much anecdotal evidence since this chapter of U.S. history is often hidden, anecdotal evidence is at times all we have.
This is America's true history, that if we had it our way, or if they had it their way, as a matter of fact, pardon my misspeaking, if they had it their way, they would erase all of this, trying to paint themselves in a positive light when they know, as a matter of fact, a lot of these things happen in my lifetime. They want us to just ignore what has happened to spare their feelings. They don't want their children to know just how wicked and evil and murderous they are. If you are a good people and a great people, you wouldn't have to do all this to be great. You would just be great. You wouldn't have to lie, steal, cheat, murder, rape, and do everything that people are imprisoned for to be a great nation. But all of that was done to establish this nation. And continuous to this day, we have sundown towns, meaning in 2023, if one of us is caught in a sundown town, we can be murdered, or we can be subject of police murder, because 9 times out of 10, it'd be one of them who either do it to you or put you in the atmosphere where it can happen.
Despite a lot of the information we have about sundown towns being based on oral tradition, experts on the topic, such as Lowen, have proven themselves to be credible. He devotes almost an entire chapter to explaining his research, detailing his rationale for defining sundown towns, laying out his statistical methods, and revealing how he triangulated oral history, written sources, and census data to arrive at a confirmation. So when he reports that he's personally verified the existence of roughly 1,000 sundown towns between 1890 and 1930, you believe him. And because he pairs that finding with an analysis of the history, causes, and patterns of sundown towns that shows that they were, in many ways, as logical, as often as violent, an outgrowth of American racism as lynching, he ultimately makes a strong case that sundown towns were a significant feature of the American landscape. As is
a young brother from Morristown, New Jersey, which is up north, northern New Jersey, who was exposing pedophiles. He was found hanged in 2021. And a brother was found hanged in Pennsylvania last year. So this is not something from the past. This is our present. This is happening today.
Is often the case when the subject of race, the relative lack of hard evidence ultimately becomes part of the story rather than the hindrance to it. Given all of this, the New York Times write that Coleman's KKK created a racial deterrent so strong that even to this day, a district judge at the Coleman courthouse says that Black people are very reluctant to come to court in Coleman because of their reputation. Coleman was, and to many still is, known as the racist white bigot county in Alabama, which, considering Alabama's history in particular, is saying something. One clipping from the Free Press said that in Skipperville, Alabama, 1899, a group called the Rectifying Band would send letters to Black people, telling them to move on and warn landlords against employing Black people. The newspaper clipping reads, "The Negroes are said to be thoroughly frightened and preparing to move. The band is variously estimated to be from 100 to 200 strong. Their plan of procedure is a novel one. It is said that they profess to be marching under the white supremacy banner. Police statement is said to favor this new solution of the problem." Arab, Alabama is a part of Marshall and Coleman County, also certainly seems ready to forget their history. At least they don't seem to address the harsh reality of it. One article from Arab's town website writes that they are proud of the past and looking to the future, all while saying that Indians gave up their land instead of Native Americans that were forced to relinquish their land, and not making any mention of having been a sundown town. Even if these are painful chapters in U.S. history, that doesn't mean we should ignore them.
They still haven't solved Dante Perez's murder. He was found lynched behind a police station. They won't even show the footage of what happened to the brother or anything. And his family is still waiting to receive justice for the hanging of their loved one, Dante Perez.
One discusses Arab in his book and explains that if a Black person did live in a sundown town, they were an exception and would, at times, purposefully need to display strong but not harmful personalities to be more likable. Lowen says that the people that were exceptions would encourage white people to call them the N-word and would often dress exceptionally well or badly and play a clownish role. Essentially, these Black people that did find themselves living in these sundown towns had to be liked by all and felt pressured to enlighten those around them because if people didn't like them, then they were in danger. All it takes is one white person willing to attack Lowen writes because other white people were sure going to defend a white person over a Black person than risk being called an N-word lover. Alabama was definitely infamous for racism, but let's take a look and see what happened to sundown towns in modern day. And if we have a sponsor for today's episode, which I'm feeling, I don't know if there will be one, this is where it's going to be. If not, let's continue on. You've got back-to-back meetings, errands to run, and chores to get taken care of. What's the secret to clearing everything on your to-do list? Well, maybe it's a little help from twos or choose from your favorite national restaurants, $10 value and 0 delivery fees on. Even if the signage doesn't exist, the racial tension and discrimination is still present in many small towns across the U.S. In Vienna, Illinois, some white residents say race isn't a big problem out there and never has been really. Meanwhile, Black residents such as Nicholas Lewis say, "Every time I walk around, eyes are on me." Places like Vienna are an open secret of racial segregation. The Columbia Daily Tribune wrote in 2020. "Every time you come into town or you go into a gas station or in a store, people look at you," said Victoria Vaughn, a biracial 17-year-old who has been coming to Vienna for years to visit her white grandparents. "You can feel them looking at you, feel them staring," she said. "I've never had anyone say anything racist to me in Vienna, but I've definitely felt the way they felt about me." She was in Vienna on a recent Saturday to join a rally organized after a group of Vienna high school students created a social media account that included the phrase "hate Black people" in its title. Vaughn and her grandmother were among the 50 or so people who turned out for the rally, along with about 25 counter-protesters. At first, things went well. Protesters and counter-protesters.
See, they have counter-protesters. You're protesting racism. And you have counter-protesters. They unmask themselves. They don't even care. They unmask themselves.
Protesters prayed together. They talked calmly about race, but not for long. Bullshit, an older white man shouted at Vaughn after she said black people aren't treated equally. They get the same as the white people get. Vaughn said Vienna's white residents may not see racial issues around them because they are far more subtle today. Until you live in a black or brown person's body, you're not going to understand, she said. You have to know somebody who lived it, or live it yourself, to truly understand. Vienna's racial history goes back to 1954 of the arrest of a 31-year-old black resident, Thomas Lee Lantham, who was accused of brutally beating an elderly white woman with a soft drink bottle and trying to rape her grandmother. A few weeks after his arrest, Lantham escaped from jail. Dozens of armed men burned down Vienna's black community. The 1950 census showed 54 black people living in Vienna. In 2000, it showed 1. It's unfortunate that it seems like these small towns are unwilling to learn, listen, and not ignore the painful past around them. Even if openly racist laws aren't legal, it doesn't mean everything has changed and that racism simply just vanished. And it's not just in the South by any means. Sundown communities are predominant in the Midwest, West, and North as well. Author Candace Taylor, who wrote the book Overground Railroad, The Green Book and the Roots of Black Travel in America, claims that sundown towns were ways the North and West patrolled and monitored race without having the colored-only or whites-only signs. Travelers had no way of knowing where the sundown towns were located because there wasn't a map until James Loewen researched and wrote the book Sundown Towns, A Hidden Dimension in American Racism, she says. Loewen discovered that many of the sundown towns would burn signs and that there's no official record that some existed at all, which shows people continue to erase the dirty parts of our history that we don't want to remember, Taylor says.
Which is exactly what Ron DeSantis and others are trying to do. They are trying to not necessarily erase, they are trying to sanitize their past as if they're the only one who were there in the past, just trying to sanitize it and clean themselves up. Instead of cleaning up their behavior and what they do, they want to lie. Just outright send teachers into schools and lie to the children, our children, and their children, making all because they don't want their children to feel bad about what they did.
Sundown towns are just like any other town in America, she says. I have been to a couple that still seem to hold on to their racist heritage, and they have a large number of white supremacist groups. These sundown towns are still overwhelmingly white, and according to some studies, there's definitely a link between sundown towns and contemporary racial equality. One such study argues that one consequence of sundown towns is that modern-day residents that live there are largely unaware of its history and assume that the massive division between whites and blacks is natural. In other cases, such as Kenilworth, Illinois, people claim that Kenilworth is just too expensive for black families, and that's why only 6 years ago they didn't have a single black household. They are the richest suburb of Chicago, yet after Loewen did his research, he found that there are 7,000 black households that make more money than the median family does in Kenilworth. They could move there in terms of economics, and even move into the larger house.
There's always some type of hate and jealousy when it comes to somebody knowing that we're earning more money than them. Even if we earn it, even if we work hard to get it, their sentiment is we don't deserve it after we work hard and earn our money and make a way for ourselves.
Houses, but they don't. Still, this black people aren't rich enough trope persists, even when this economic gap might not be the reason why black people simply don't feel welcome in these communities. And this is a prime example of why we shouldn't burn the sundown signs, but preserve and learn from them so that the people living there today recognize that black people weren't allowed to settle there and that their absence from sundown towns was due to prejudice. Places that are all white on purpose help breed and support negative perceptions of black people and lead to entitlement and white privilege. In some cases, the people living there think they have a right to want to live in an all-white community and therefore should be allowed to tell black people to go elsewhere. These racist attitudes lead to poverty disparities and protect white advantage. Sundown towns are especially still a problem for black drivers, and though I don't normally use BuzzFeed as a news source, a recent article does detail how recent and disturbing some interactions in these sundown towns can be. One hiker, Marco Williams,
sundown towns is not even really about living next to a white person or living in that community. It's about we're being stopped and victimized because we're traveling through a sundown town or a city that's considered a sundown town. We may be in transition going back and forth to work or going, first we should be able to travel freely anyway. Yet, if we're caught in a so-called sundown town, we're subject to what happened to our brother, what's the brother name who got killed in Brunswick, Georgia, Ahmaud Arbery. We're subject to things like that happening to us. And the brother that was working for FedEx or anybody who we're delivering packages or we're the mailman, if we're seen on one of their porches, we are shot at. And this is not happening when the sun go down. This shit is happening in broad daylight.
Williams took to TikTok and claimed that last year in June 2020, he planned a trip to visit the Devil's Bathtub in Virginia. He says that it's in the middle of nowhere, and when he stopped to refuel and get snacks at a service station, he was told by the cashier to not be around after dark as he was in a sundown town. Now, I can't verify that Marco really told this, but according to Lowen's database, at least 60 of Kentucky's 782 towns are believed to be or previously were considered sundown towns. Lowen explains that it's incredibly important to chronicle this part of a town's history because not only is it important to remember our history, but states can have second-generation sundown town problems as well. Take Ferguson, Missouri, for example. Ferguson was briefly a sundown town between 1940 to 1960. Lowen says the black population was thrown out by the white population and was enforced by an overwhelmingly white police force, which would ticket and harass black motorists for passing through. He says, well, by the time Ferguson had the, shall we say, riots or demonstrations for which they are now famous, Ferguson was almost 2/3 black. But it still had that leftover from the sundown town day police force. So that's an example of a second-generation sundown town problem. Jacoby Williams is a professor of African American and African diaspora studies at Indiana University and specializes in social justice, politics, and civil rights. He explains the relationship policing had to sundown towns during their heyday and how it relates to the distrust of policing we're seeing today. So, for example, if a person, these are anecdotal, but these are real lived experiences, a person of color is in a particular location that's classified as a sundown town, and the people of that community attack that person, the police will not arrest them. In fact, they may arrest the person who was attacked. Today, This is something that can easily translate to law enforcement harassing people of color, or on a lesser scale of things, dirty looks between mixed race couples and things of that nature. But what about Coleman? Are they still as bad as ever? Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Some residents have claimed in recent years that it's unfortunate that they're known as a sundown town because they're progressing into the 21st century. A Juneteenth celebration at Veterans Memorial Park in June 2020 was hosted by the Committee for a Better Coleman. A member of this community, A.C. Potee, said that, if we don't do it now, it's never going to happen. If we don't have a good turnout from the black community, that's understandable, but we are going to show them it's safe, it's all good. However, even if the community wants to show black people that their neighborhood is safe, they have a long way to go. Hansville police reported that they got calls from neighbors who were unhappy the event was taking place at all.
I'm going to go to the next video where a brother giving his testimony of what happened to him when he traveled through a sundown town. This is 2023.
In the history of America, there were towns in the United States called sundown towns.
This video is courtesy of the brother Philip Scott of the African diaspora.
Now, those of you who are not from America that could be watching this video, a sundown town is basically
video courtesy of the Black congregation, brother Philip Scott.
A town full of racist white supremacists, male and female. And if you're a black person in that town at nightfall, then they will attack and take your life. You understand what I'm saying? So even in 2023, You still have sundown towns in America, but yet America will go to a lot of your countries and try to tell you about democracy and human rights, but yet they have sundown towns in America. Case in point, you have a brother that's going to detail some things that he experienced going in certain sundown towns. Let's roll that.
He said you're going to get the have Volvos here. Yeah. We don't park Volvos here. So in the video, you can see the lady talking about basically telling him, you're in a sundown town. You need to get the hell out of here right now. This has happened to me on multiple occasions. The verbiage is never going to be specific. You just got to listen to what white supremacists are saying. One time I'm in the 7076 interchange, small town in Pennsylvania. Hella trucks go through it every day, all day. I pull over to the side of this dirt road, ask this non-threatening white man who's walking, hey, which way do I go? And he looked so like a regular, cool white person. But the way he talked to me, the verbiage that he used, let me know I was not welcome. He was just like, do you know where you at? You know, it's not too many of y'all that look like you that's over here. And just different little stuff. And he got more, not violent, but the more aggressive in his verbiage with every freaking word. He was trying to let me know, because he was like, oh, this ninja can't take hints. And I couldn't. He was telling me, get your black out of here. So y'all need to learn how to pay attention when white people are talking for verbal cues that don't make no sense.
America can't tell no country about human rights, because I always tell any person in any country, if they try to come wagging their finger at you about human rights on any level, their Achilles heel is Black America. You tell them, well, you talking about human rights, you got sundown towns in America in 2023 where Black people, they caught in that town, they're going to unalive them in 2023. What are you talking about? Look at what your police do to Black people. That is their Achilles heel. You can also tell them, look at what they dealt with slavery, and you still haven't even made that right. You didn't even pay reparations to Black Americans. How you gonna come over here telling us about any kind of human rights and democracy? You have no human rights and democracy in your country. So go do human rights and show us how it's done first. Then you come over here and tell us, and then we will listen to you.
Interchange, small town in Pennsylvania. Hella trucks go through it every day, all day. I pull over to the side of this dirt road, ask this non-threatening white man who's...
I'll move on to the next video. This is the last video.
It's not a unique one and is incredibly common among white Americans. I've been guilty of a similar reaction myself whenever friends would link the violent state-sanctioned racism of the past with the conditions of the world today. Often my replies were along the lines of, well, yeah, all of that stuff was awful and I don't want it to happen.
Peace and dog. Thanks for coming.
That all happened before my parents were even born. It wasn't my fault. What can I do about it? The answer is that we can do something, anything, more than just sweeping it back under the rug like we've grown so dependent on doing since the civil rights movement of the 1960s. When we field accusations of systemic racism, which we all take part in, we need to challenge ourselves to look deeper. It's not that we're all evil, bad people who are itching to go join the next lynch mob. Those people still exist, but they're now a small minority. But even the most open-minded, loving white people in Florida still grew up in a community that had quite literally been shaped by racism.
Is there a such thing as that? Oh, I have yet to meet one.
In the decades prior. It is difficult, if not impossible, to spend your formative years in such an environment without it having some impact on your core beliefs about what your community should look like and what roles each demographic should play in it. Challenging your core beliefs is hard. It's really uncomfortable. It becomes unbearably uncomfortable when doing so would put you at the risk of falling into the category of racist and therefore make you a bad person. We want to think of ourselves as good people, and since racism is a characteristic normally attributed to bad people, we tend to hold, I am not racist in any way, as one of many core beliefs about ourselves. This often comes into conflict.
Their favorite saying is, I'm not racist. Some of my best friends are black, but you never see them hanging out with their best friends or being around their best friends.
With other beliefs that we may come to hold subconsciously as a result of our environment, such as it is normal for the community I live in to be mostly or entirely white, or it is natural for politicians to be largely white and male. When changes occur that shift reality away from what we had come to know as normal, increased diversity in neighborhoods, the election of more women and people of color to government office, there is an unavoidable desire to right the world by making it return to what we knew before. This is done out of a need for consistency and comfort. Mankind has always been largely resistant to social change in the short term, and the modern era is no exception. What makes the modern day unique is that the public consciousness has shifted to a point where overt racism is no longer acceptable. This has led to the creation of a situation in which, in the desire for normalcy, we find ways to maintain the status quo, one that has been heavily shaped by America's history with racism, without admitting to the factor of race playing any part in the way we write laws, distribute wealth and resources, and arrange our communities. All Americans, white Americans in particular, have spent the last 50 years learning to suppress and ignore the cognitive dissonance that arises from proclaiming to live in a society that treats all people equally, regardless of race, gender, class, and sexuality, while that same society is visibly divided along those very same lines. When such an obvious contradiction is brought to our attention, we shut down. Our ability to see ourselves as good people who are therefore not racist depends on it. To admit that our current reality reflects the atrocities in our past would be admitting the need for significant and widespread changes to the way our society operates. This is a frightening prospect to many because we've never really tried it before in our lifetimes, and there's no way to know what it would look like or how it would affect our daily lives. There's just too much uncertainty involved, so it's easier to just keep things the way they are now. After all, we've come pretty far since the days of slavery and segregation, haven't we? Well, we have and we haven't. America has gradually walked away from more blatant violations of human rights like slavery and segregation, but these changes were never accompanied by an effective, widespread effort to make amends for the wrongs of the past. Rather, the agreement that these abuses would no longer be permitted by the law was seen as a sufficient compromise, allowing the government to pat itself on the back for its good deed, while the people of the country were left to decide what would happen on the local level. Local and state governments, particularly in the South, were often controlled by politicians who had actively opposed ending slavery or prohibiting segregation, and would spend the years following such major changes doing everything in their power to preserve the previous status quo. As we can see from the current disparities between races in things like wealth, access to healthcare, and education, as well as the segregation that is still present in many major cities in America, the status quo has remained largely intact. Despite all of this, we are living in an age of unprecedented progress. America's youngest generations have seen the rise of technology, particularly the internet, shape our childhoods and alter the way we think about our future. We've seen TVs and laptops go from fat to flat. We've watched cell phones change from clunky bricks to flip phones to the sleek standard accessory of the modern adult. We've seen accessing the internet shift from hogging the family phone line.
That is progress when it comes to technology. Yet this technology is really serving as a counterintelligence program, because when some of us get on these devices and on these platforms and speak the truth, we are punished for it. Our channels are suspended, and we're told that we are violating community guidelines for telling the truth. Lying and acting a damn fool is consistent with the community guidelines. But when people are telling the truth, it's frowned upon, and our channels are stricken, taken down and suspended.
To being so widespread that you can do it from almost anywhere with no need for a wired connection. Working, banking, socializing, all of these things can be done virtually now. We have lived through so many of the biggest changes in human history that we sometimes forget just how monumental they are. It also makes it easier to ignore the changes we haven't been making. An America truly free of racism and its lingering effects on our institutions is a long way away, but it is not impossible. It requires teamwork, sacrifice, and a collective desire to leave the world a more equal and peaceful place than we found it. This desire needs to be reflected in the way we organize our communities and shape our legal and financial systems. And to do that, we need to elect leaders who legislate based on a guiding principle of equality and dignity for all people.
Now I'm going to ask you to eat the fruit and spit out the pit. I don't subscribe to this electing of officials to govern over us. I just want to make that disclaimer. Just this part you don't need to consume. I'm dealing with the Sundown states, and I don't know where he's going with this. I'm going to play a few more minutes of it, and I'm going to move on.
So, where are we at now? Out of curiosity, I decided to take a look at some of the powerful figures in Florida politics in 1920 and compare them to the powerful political figures in Florida today to see what kind of progress the state has made in the past century. Records were scarce on Florida's House and Senate leadership in 1920, but records on Florida's governors from the time were more complete. Florida's governor in the years leading up to 1910 was Democrat Napoleon B. Broward, for whom Broward County was named. Broward was an unashamed racist and segregationist who went so far as to suggest that the state and federal governments should purchase territory that could then be used to resettle the Black population that would be forcibly removed from Florida. Years later in 1920, our governor was Sidney Johnston Katz of the Prohibition Party, the son of a Confederate captain who combined his strong anti-Catholic sentiment with his even stronger racism to rile support from a conservative white base. He openly viewed Black Floridians as an inferior race and responded to well-publicized lynchings by stating that
inferior, but built the whole entire nation, but we're inferior.
Only the vagrant, vagabond, worthless Negro is lynched. After the NAACP drew further attention to lynchings in Florida, he went so far as to declare, "Your race is always harping on the disgrace it brings to the state by a concourse of white people taking our revenge for the dishonoring of a white woman, when if you would, teach your people to not kill our white officers and disgrace our white women, you would keep down 1,000 times greater disgrace." Katz's racism did.
I swear, white people will lie in a heartbeat and don't even care. You can see it today. We record them and they'll still lie. Thumb their nose at the camera and still lie. We know they lied in the past when they used to do things to us and it was our word against theirs. But they'll lie right in front of a camera, a 4K camera. They'll lie with such clarity. They'll lie.
Didn't just show in his words. It was a key component of his political platform from day one. In his inauguration speech, he proclaimed, "Your triumph is no less in this good hour, beautiful Florida, for you have withstood the onslaughts of the county and state political rings, the corporations, the railroads, the fierce opposition of the press and organization of the Negro voters of this state against you, and the power of the Roman Catholic hierarchy against you. Yet over all these, the common people of Florida, the everyday cracker people, have triumphed." Katz's populist rhetoric, the notion that he and his supporters represented the downtrodden.
I'm glad that he recognized that he's a cracker. I'm glad that he recognized that. And he recognized that because he knows that when he considered one of us out of line, they crack the whip, which is the definition of a cracker. they crack the whip to try to keep the brother or the sister in line. He recognized that and he wear that with pride. What a damn devil.
Trodden, everyday people who were being persecuted by an assortment of state and private entities bears a striking similarity to the kinds of speeches that Donald Trump used to win over Florida voters in the 2016 and 2020 United States presidential campaigns. The similarities between the two politicians don't end there. After his term as governor ended, Katz faced a number of personal and criminal scandals over his conduct in office. He was investigated for accepting bribes in exchange for pardons. The next month, a federal warrant was issued against him for the involuntary servitude of 2 Black people forced to work on his plantation in northern Florida. He allegedly cried, "My enemies won't let me alone," when he was arrested, but later expressed confidence that he would be acquitted. He ultimately was acquitted by an all-white jury and went on to run 2 more.
Of course, he was acquitted. All white jury in an all white town, and his charges was what they all do, have us work, can't see in the morning to can't see at night for either free or close to free labor. Of course he was acquitted.
More failed political campaigns before being arrested once again, this time for his involvement in a plan to distribute $1 million in counterfeit money. That trial resulted in a mistrial, and ultimately Katz was acquitted once again. He returned to the comfort of his Sunbright plantation in Defuniak Springs, where he died years later. In short, Katz was
May he rest in peace.
a con man and a criminal who consistently managed to weasel his way out of facing the consequences of his actions. To see how much progress Florida has made since then, I looked at our 2 most recent governors. Former governor and current Florida U.S. Senator Rick Scott's most notable achievement in his early career would probably be defrauding Medicare, Medicaid, and other federal programs for billions of dollars. He pled the Fifth Amendment over 75 times in a court hearing about his fraud case, and his company, Columbia HCA, was fined $1.7 billion in a healthcare fraud settlement that was the largest in U.S. history at the time. After departing from the company, Rick Scott used his leftover fraud money to start an investment business to make the kind of cash that gets you so rich that you never have to work again. Having freed up his work time for other pursuits, he then ran a high-dollar campaign for and won the office of governor of Florida in 2010 and
This government is ran by thieves, governed by crooks.
served until 2018. He knew better than to be openly racist, but anytime there was an issue on voting rights, he came down on the side of making voting more restrictive and less accessible. He also denied the reality of climate change and put significant restrictions on the ability of the Florida Department of Environmental Protection to respond to climate change. This decision, while ultimately harmful to us all, will have a disproportionate negative impact on communities of color in Florida and around the world. He was an early supporter and frequent defender of Donald Trump from 2015 onward. Rick Scott was succeeded by Ron DeSantis, another enthusiastically pro-Trump Republican.
Here is the current devil, Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis.
Who sees himself as future United States president material. Not to be outdone by Barack Obama's 1995 memoir, Dreams from My Father, Ron DeSantis self-published the widely unread Dreams from Our Founding Fathers in 2011, just before a successful 2012 run for Florida's 6th congressional district in the U.S. House of Representatives. In his book, DeSantis argued that it was unfair to blame the Founding Fathers for allowing slavery in America and criticizes Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall for accusing the Founding Fathers of hypocrisy. He states that the Constitution was written in a way that made slavery designed to fail, and that the 3/5 compromise directly
made slavery designed to fail. This is the same guy that said that we learned a trade while our people were enslaved, and we benefited from slavery because some of us learned trades, and some of us became blacksmiths. You know, we learned trades, learned how to shoe a horse and build homes for them and plow their fields and pick their cotton, whatever they said they did during slavery. He wants us to support the narrative or believe that learning a trade and generational wealth is an even trade. This is wicked.
Benefited abolitionist states over slaveholding states. He used the rest of the book to criticize Obama's support of a UN convention dedicated to ending violence against women and said that Obama was showcasing his father's Muslim roots and his middle name of Hussein to pander to countries in the Middle East. As Rick Scott's second term drew to a close, DeSantis set his sights on the governor's office and prepared to take the next step in his political journey. He faced off against Tallahassee Mayor Andrew Gillum in a contentious race that saw both men's integrity questioned in the public discourse. DeSantis took a lot of heat from the media when he claimed that Florida shouldn't monkey up this election by voting for Gillum in what was
monkey up this election by voting for Gillum. In 2021, he said monkey up. See, that's when I would lose my professionalism and Ron DeSantis would get his eyebrows knocked off. I would try to knock his eyebrows off for saying that about me.
Was widely seen as a racist dog whistle to his supporters. DeSantis ultimately won a narrow victory and assumed his role as the governor of Florida, where he will likely remain through a second term. Governor DeSantis faced his first major public health crisis in the spring of 2020 as the United States became aware of the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic within its own borders. The federal government under then-President Donald Trump downplayed the severity of the pandemic and put up harsh resistance to any suggestions of nationwide lockdowns or mask mandates. DeSantis followed Trump's example and encouraged Floridians to take a business-as-usual approach to suppressing the pandemic, avoiding any public safety measures that might restrict Florida's
don't you mean bullshit as usual
tourism-dependent economy. Florida's case count and death toll rose steadily in the months that followed. When vaccines finally began to arrive in early 2021, DeSantis faced renewed criticism for allegedly focusing vaccine distribution in the wealthy, mostly white zip codes where his supporters and donors live, instead of focusing on the minority and low-income communities that have been hit the hardest by the pandemic. He responded by warning local officials to not complain about his vaccine distribution if they wanted to receive their promised doses.
No, enough of that. That is not synonymous, and it has nothing to do with sundown towns. He went somewhere else with it. I know politicians has something to do with it. I know law enforcement and government agencies have something to do with sundown towns, yet he was going somewhere else with it. And that's not where I wanted to go with the subject matter. I hope that this stream was informative, and hope you got something out of it. I'm going to say peace to Ant Dog, peace to Big Dog Philly OG, peace to Doe Eyes, peace to Marco Power, peace to Mummy Chula. Again, Marco Power, peace to Anthony Lowe, peace to Riza Lopez. Thank you for coming through. Everybody have a wonderful evening. Be safe. Be prosperous. Until the next time, this is The Enemy's Public. I am Bro.Nasir. Like, share, subscribe. Leave a comment in the comment section. Peace.
Yo, the enemy's public, I gotta keep my eyes open. Pay attention, stop walking around like you blindfolded. This not the World Cup, but Nasir be kicking knowledge. This the type of information you can never learn in college. It's time to fight back, it's no more trying to play it cool. We got interviews, podcasts, and got the latest news. So sit back and relax, we about to get it started. Earth is a canvas, and guess who's the con artist? They brainwashing us, the system corrupted. You are now rocking with the enemy's public. You are now rocking with the enemy's public. I said you are now rocking with the enemy's public. Hey.